Hello everyone, today we comment on Kings and Generals' recent video titled Why Was Germany So Fragmented in the Middle Ages? That chronologically actually extends up to the French Revolution, or so the 18th century, so to say, after Voltaire's famous remark on the nature of the Holy Roman Empire. I've never made this so far. At the very beginning of Schwerpunkt, I was offered a chance to become a script writer for Kings and Generals, but as I told them, I'm not really working for anyone. I haven't, I think, ever commented, in fact, on their work before. I thought this content was interesting to sort of review because I often make the case that essentially the simplified history channels are too short more than else. It's not like that they have necessarily bad information, but they may not necessarily focus on the actual question, like in this case that is posed. Let's see if that is the case. There is also a similar video titled Why Was Italy So Fragmented in the Middle Ages? I remember that I watched that one for the same reason, wanting to make a video, and overall the information presented was okay. I would have personally sort of illustrated the matter in different terms, and where I actually to comment on that was still in time. Just the other day, this new word video caught my eye, and I wanted to hear essentially how to explain the thing. So I've already made some video commentary in the past, not many, actually just a bunch, over thousands. This is technically a way to make views that is not so excessively successful. Like, the fundamentals of the channel will remain the same. I don't think I'm going to ever specialize in criticizing other channels' content, also because I don't watch other channels, but there may be some benefit out of it because K and G is sort of the biggest channel around that covers similar topics with a slightly different philosophy from my own. For example, I have never made a video criticism of, I don't even remember what was the title, but it was something like, the Crusades seen from the Muslim side, which I thought it was actually a pretty bad video, and I will explain why at some point. But again, this is such a big channel that this is the point why I'm here for, like, sort of understanding what's the scripting, what's behind the scripting process, right? How they articulate this, because it's such a big channel that they have evidently different people writing different scripts based, presumably, on the respective author's background and specialization. I don't know what's the work process behind this teamwork, even assuming that this is actually coordinated in terms of probably they had scattered script writers. I know that some of them actually follows me as being at least once involved, because he stated that himself in creating a script for, I think it was Kings and Generals, and it turned out that he used one of my scripts as a basis for their own, which is fine. At least I appreciated the honesty for saying that, but it was also, I'm sure, original. You can't take inspiration from things, etc. And I think this is already one thing about this video, because I have to reflect till the end to express an informed judgment, because I've already read the transcript. This is what we're going to do. We're going to read the transcript and commenting on it. But it's only by entangling the wall that you can make a correct evaluation. Make too many videos knowing that you may put together a script, a sketch, but that only at the end of the video you will have developed the most insightful notions that were already there in potential had you sort of tried to explain them. In fact, that's what happens at this stage, and you didn't have the time, just looked at what it was before making the video. So let's simply go at it. Let's say that everything I read that I don't comment on is something I fundamentally agree on. This is not the point of the video. Over time, we will develop different ideas because as information accumulates. So when looking at the maps of Europe throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period, history lovers, I would just point out one thing. There are immediately because, you know, the focus of this video sometimes is expected on the basis of the title, right? So if I read why was Germany so fragmented in the Middle Ages, I can find much more fitting examples, like on certain videos on YouTube, like, I don't know, I think it was Invicta who made a video about the Khanai was all a farce, like it didn't go like that, and the bottom line was, you know, I used like a, you know, video game to project the exact amount of soldiers without even actually thinking how legions could be deployed in different ways, and giving some basic say numbers as a standard that we don't even know whether they were there, and pretending that there is a problem in how, not in actually how the battle went, of course, but mostly how the, I don't know, some people drew simplified maps used even at West Point. But I would like, for example, to make a response to that. But it's such a long video as well. If anything, I would take more time. But the bottom line of that video did not actually correspond to the premises. So also in this case, I'm a medievalist, so I was attracted to why Germany was fragmented, in particular in the Middle Ages. As you know, we made lots of videos about the modern Holy Roman Empire as well, and we sort of really looked at this specific issue from the within. However, here we're talking something that is beyond the Middle Ages as well. So when looking at this, history lovers often cannot help but notice the incomprehensible mess at its center, the very definition of border gore and the bane of cartographers, the Holy Roman Empire. It has been a target of jokes since the time of Voltaire, and it remains one today. The Holy Roman Empire is a historical outlier. For centuries, it was a remnant of medieval feudalism in a world of centralized sovereign states. In this video, we explore the reasons why the Holy Roman Empire was decentralized as it was, trace the story of its fragmentation, and explain its historical reluctance to consolidate from one confusing mess with powerful consequences to another. So first of all, I would like to point out one thing that these channels normally do in a bit of a rhetorical, dialectical way, out of the obvious needs of approximation and sort of general presentation. Yes, we understand here what's the border gore meme about. Everybody knows about Voltaire's statement. We'll come back on also later to it. However, we should point out something, that the ways, of course, like the Holy Roman Empire is represented in its political fragmentation in medieval and in also early modern times, does not necessarily mean that, especially the earlier, of course, you go in time, this was such an anomaly, considering the actual nature of political power being exerted in these places, right? There were some states that we tend to represent as more unitary, that in many ways were even less developed in terms of actual centralistic capacity. I mean, what you see in the typical 19th century map, where you have one state, one color, and with perfectly outlined boundaries, also for medieval realities, of course, is different. I know that kings and generals know this, but let's say that this is hardly represented for other countries were basically the same, and that we're going, regardless of this representation, towards even a further level of failed statehood. Look at, I don't know, Bohemia or Hungary. This is typical of Central Europe. In fact, Germany fits this as well, but it's also, as we will explain now, different from these Western Slavic and Hungarian powers. Same for Poland, by the way, but also other European powers. And that, again, are two different things. The way you have a formal fragmentation on a map to represent power is not actually how power was overall wielded. Like, it's not even meant to indicate that in the same way at the time, right? So there is also this aspect that I would emphasize, that for centuries the fact that Germany was a remnant of medieval feudalism in a world of centralized sovereign states is a bit too much unless you approximate by considering sort of the fate of just Western European powers in general, in any other power that was sort of more actually centralized. Because when you talk, in fact, about, I don't know, Poland, Lithuania, you talk about the Muscovy, you talk about the Ottoman Empire, etc., you may think they were sort of more power concentrated. Centralized is excessive. I use the term power concentration just by vocabulary because centralized is a terminology very often connected with mostly contemporary state. I know that modernists sometimes try to enforce this for the Renaissance. A centralized state was born, as if the actual state in the 16th century worked in a substantially different way from the ones in the later Middle Ages, for example. We all know that modern history did not exist. We go straight from the Middle Ages to the contemporary era. So that actually, going back on the problem of power, it's not like Germany was an anomaly in a world of centralized sovereign states, right? Everything that basically goes central, Eastern Europe is something definitely not centralized. And I would say that the Germans were still sovereign in their own land. At large, they were infiltrated by other powers, and quite heavily so at point, but there wasn't a conquest of Germany, as a matter of fact, if not for some fringe areas, especially from the French side, and that also is to be explained. And of course, this is not to say that, indeed, just like with Italy, by the 18th century, Germany was considered, in fact, one of the so-called weak areas of Europe, because they were so fragmented. And of course, the big elephant in the room here is the Habsburgic state, that, as we will see now, of course, has a space in this video script, and later Prussia and so on. However, there is degree of national recognizability, we could say, within Germany, that while exceptionally fragmented in a, say, formal political sense, is also not practical in the way power was wielded that distant from still relatively dysfunctional powers that, albeit represented as more unitary, did have a lot of, for example, oligarchic and entrenched and untamable oligarchic power that ended up sort of destroying the system in the end. Look at Poland, for example. So let's go on. The rise of feudalism and fragmentation. This is a subtitle. We'll skip these, however. When Pope Leo III proclaimed Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans, he was dealing with a sovereign monarch, the King of the Franks. Charlemagne presided over a tribe that had been in control of Gaul since the time of King Clovis. The Franks were eager to learn from the Romans, and say that this is true in a broader sense. Terminology, maybe tribe is not, by the time of Charlemagne, that fitting for the Franks to say people at large, and the connections with Rome, at least this is a famously key topic among my followers, so they know that there's more to that, but this is just an introduction, so it's normal to, again, skip certain things. Unlike their Germanic cousins, they converted to the Roman Church instead of its schismatic rival, the Arian Church. However, in many aspects, the Franks remained the same bunch of rough tribesmen they had been during the time of Attila the Hun. Also, this is relatively debatable considering what happened to the Franks with the rise of the Merovingian monarchy. At least the system of power was very different from then. In any case, crucially, they retained the custom of partitioning their property between sons, and this is true, property which included their kingdoms. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Francia suffered multiple civil wars, and the long-haired descendants of King Clovis even lost their throne to the Carolingians. Charlemagne's descendants followed the same practice as his Merovingian predecessors. His successor, Louis the Pious, waged multiple wars against his own sons. Charlemagne's grandchildren expected their customary shares of land. As a result, the Frankish realm was divided in three: West, Middle, and East Francia. Middle Francia, the central and most prestigious domain, fractured even further. In West Francia, the Carolingians gave way to the Capetians, and initially the Capetian rule was rather nominal. In East Francia, kings had the most power. And I would say you understand here where they're going. They're basically emphasizing the true, say, Frankish practice of splitting inheritance in relatively equal parts among the male sons, which was objectively a plague for the overall stability of the empire, that in turn was, however, mirroring the inherent limitations of the power systems of the time. Naturally, throughout the Middle Ages, things change, as we will see now from the same video. However, the connection here with East Francia, simply skipping from the Charlemagne to essentially the Ottonians, because that's where the Eastern Frankish monarchy actually gets greater power, is, again, can't be done for a video that lasts, I think, like 16-17 minutes. However, it should require a bit of a context, because it's important for how the German monarchy would later develop. Right, we will understand this better now, but essentially, I don't need also to recall all the videos made on this. This is not the point overall. It's already a big deal if anybody watches this. In any case, the Eastern Frankish kingdom was actually more backwards compared to the Western one. And in this sense, it's paradoxical that the Ottonians would manage to get more power in East Francia, definitely compared to the West. Two things though. The West had hyper-fragmented because feudalism was already very developed, say the vassalitic beneficiary system, and because Gaul was much richer than Germany, which meant essentially that when the great Carolingian expansions had stopped, the local Western Frankish lords had enough power locally to simply say, okay, I bail out of any sort of public commitment, I start building my own seigneury from these places. Let's keep ourselves here now, things like the Sanguine invasions that we will come back to for a while. But comparatively, you can say that what was happening in France at this point is what will happen in this meme of German fragmentation later on, right? As a stage of development, right? What you see, this is also present, for example, among the Western Slavs, the monarchies of which were initially apparently more compact, but also sort of failed on the longer run towards the modern age. Why? Because they had lacked this previous gluing factor originally, and the system sort of failed in a privatistic one where there was practically no public authority. The West, say Western Europe, had passed through that, but it was more advanced, and even though this fragmentation existed, paradoxically, that all those lords became the glue that, while growing, would create a hierarchy capable of sustaining a much greater power and state and public authority. Paradoxically, the reasons why the Ottonians succeeded in Germany is that they had less power leverageable, let's say, from the same Germany until, as we'll see, and you know the story, external threat, chiefly the Magyars, and especially the opportunity to wage war to Italy would simply say, make the German princes say, okay, we'll give you that enough power to go wage war elsewhere to first defend us and go over to Italy. But at the same time, this is a much more dependent power on these local princes since a very early age, because actually this country that has been basically civilized only by Charlemagne's time, and that risks to be destabilized up until, in fact, the rise of the Ottonians and their success against the Magyars, especially destabilizing the eastern part, was more dysfunctional, was more backwards in a sense. And actually, even though, as here the script says, in East Francia, kings had the most power, which is true in an international sense, for what was actually enacted, this power was not actually that intense at a strictly territorial level. I mean, the Ottonians could even get their Roman crown by floating over this enormous territory, Germany, Burgundy, Italy, and even beyond, exactly because at a local level, they could not satisfactorily centralize. This is basically on a national basis, this is the leitmotif of German history, this failure of the German national monarchy. That it was much more convenient, say, to create an empire in the Mediterranean from Germany and to rule from places like Palermo or Rome, hopefully, to also hope to reunite the world system, then try to curb German princes in areas that also were like the northern part of the country that were not worth it in a concrete sense. So this is very important because here it sounds as if, Carolingian Empire ends and magically East Francia had more power than the others in a simple way that would sort of oddly predispose Germany for a better future that was, however, negated. This is, I understand this is not a mistake, but it can gliss over the fact that still at this point Germany had a lot of problems, like all these other countries. And so what happened was mostly the product of an international situation rather than a strong, sound power at a national level. Going on, someone had to guard the kingdom's long eastern frontier, so the nobility had a vested interest in a strong, effective monarchy. And here we should say that this happens when Germany gets fed up of the fact that the Magyars can cross it all the time just because there are German princes that are escaping and they can afford to escape a concentrated royal power just by using, in fact, these barbarians against it, because that's literally how it happened. That's how it happened practically for the entire second invasions all across Europe. And in that sense, the monarchy was that dependent on them. So it's arguable that this monarchy was actually effective as a simple entity just per se. Of course, it was the nobility, as it's explained here, that allowed the monarchy to be powerful. It could have not been otherwise, but up to that point had sort of been rowing backward, just like most other provincial entities had been doing in post-Carolingian Europe. Going on, ideologically, however, the empire remained united. Very important, yes. Its actual territory could be limited, but its mission was universal. There could only be one empire at a time and only one emperor, just like there was only one god in heaven. The Byzantines and their schismatic icon-worshipping pretenders did not count, obviously. Since the time of Charlemagne, there had always been some form of quote-unquote Roman emperor in the West. First Louis the Pious, then the rulers of Middle Francia, and then the rulers of Italy. Those emperors saw themselves as kings of kings, the rulers of multiple distinct entities, up to a certain point, by the way, because some of these realities were very regional, right? I don't know, if the Duke of Spoleto that lives literally next to Rome can have himself crowned emperor, he doesn't even control most of Italy, as a matter of fact. Anyway, to them, going on, transforming into some kind of a unified national monarchy was undesirable. At the time, this is debatable, really, because most of these rulers, as we explained, did depend on such a basis. I mean, even the Ottonians that we just explained how being dependent on the local nobility and also outer peoples really were for being recognized as overall defenders. And so again, as I use the expression floating over this platform without being too, crossing it without being too heavy on any single place, were, of course, pursuing a national policy of sort. Like the Saxons, of course, had their base in Saxony. They were trying to hegemonize Germany. They mostly connected with the Franconian area that was also bearing the grandeur of the originary people of the Franks. It was one of the most developed parts of Germany because of the early Frankish colonization that had been carried out since the 6th century back to Germany from the same goal, where the Franks had largely settled the center of power. But in that sense, the Teutonians barely ever controlled in any sort of direct way, conventionally approximately beyond those regions in Germany. They could be kings of Germany, of Italy, of Burgundy, as we know, and they could actually work from these bases of power. They could go fight up to southern Italy against the Saracens, And in this sense, they did have, of course, a universal policy that they wanted to use to gain ever more power, a bit like later Central European rulers were trying to accumulate kingdoms, but why? Because they don't have too much power in their own respective nations that are, however, desperately trying to seek, right? The Ottonians would try to subject Sweden, subject Lorraine, Bavaria, etc. But of course, most of these areas were pretty much autonomous, decentralized, and it's not like a unified national monarchy was undesirable, because from that you could actually create a veritable empire, what we conventionally define as empire. One people basically rules over others, like the Franks had successfully done for a long time. It was very concrete. So again, it's not really the case. A unified national monarchy actually is very functional to an imperial purpose. In fact, that's what tendentially Germany will try to do, regardless of the limits that the same Germany presented. So it shouldn't be confused, right? The actual power and the one that they wanted to get. It is true for the Germans in particular that, again, they would have probably left Germany, as it factually happened later on with the Hohenstaufen, for Italy, and turning Germany into some kind of peripheral province of a much bigger empire. But they were doing so because they were operating from sort of much more sound national monarchies like Sicily, that was light years ahead in terms of civil development, of power concentration compared to Central Europe, right? But not bailing out of the. In fact, the Hohenstaufen would take great care of Sicily in that sense, for that very universal purpose that does pass through that specific national power. That they were, of course, proud of being German, of being kings of Italy, of Sicily, also these realities that existed beyond the Holy Roman Empire. But in this sense, they were not bailing out of the idea of sort of strengthening their national monarchies. Going on, at the time, the might of the monarchs increasingly relied on armored knights. An average freeman could not afford the equipment necessary to be one. Thus, monarchs granted their men thieves pieces of land to govern and enrich themselves in exchange for military service. The holders of those fiefs were king's vassals, and they could have their own vassals, and they, in turn, could have their own too. This pyramid, combined with Frankish succession customs, gradually introduced Western Europe to feudalism, with all of its border gore beauty. I would say that tendentially feudalism was developing in properly as feudalism. I will not digress now on the usage of the term. I'm for the conventional one, so I'm fine with it. But say the more feudalism affirms, and actually the less the practice of splitting the fiefs in equal parts, so that would go towards some kind of the centrifugal, let's say, direction would occur. Right? With feudalism, say with the 10th century, with 11th to 12th, you do really have that tribal mindset of equal split over. There is a main line that basically gets most of power, and the others want some of it too, and that's how it will continue in feudalism, but they're not really superimposable, because they're going tendentially in a different direction. They belong also to different political and social realities over time. Going on, elections, however, actually this is one of the subtitles I didn't eliminate anyway. However, out of all the major kingdoms of medieval Europe, only the Holy Roman Empire retained this fragmented state. If you're talking in general, the more you go on in time, yes, but it's not like at the time, say by the 12th century, the 13th century, the Holy Roman Empire was particularly more fragmented than other powers, right? You could have, again, the quite neatly outlined borders of Poland and saying, this is a single country, but the way we have drawn those maps is mostly a 19th century mentality, mostly focused, this is important to stress, on German particularism, the Sonderweg, and the fact that apparently that German fragmentation was more important to to represent, because it was sort of added detail, a layer of depth in the representation of German politics and institutions. It's not like in other countries they didn't have this, or they were in a sense more dysfunctionally decentralized than Germany, right? Then the situation exacerbated later, but we'll get now say further. Yet let's understand this aspect better. An often presented argument, the script says, for why this was so the greater fragmentation state of Germany compared to all the major kingdoms of medieval Europe, is that unlike in kingdoms with hereditary monarchies, the Holy Roman Emperor was an elected position. Now let's let them finish and then comment on this. To be elected, the aspiring candidate sold concessions and privileges to the nobles. Thus, the monarchy got weaker and was unable to centralize. To test this argument, let's explore the empire's electoral system. Initially, the empire was not quite an outlier within Europe. The rule in most medieval European kingdoms was not strictly hereditary and not strictly elected either. So, yeah, this is, of course, the point I wanted to get myself. Usually it was a mix of the two. In England, royal succession needed the consent of the aristocracy, while the kings of France pushed for hereditary rule by crowning their sons during their own lifetimes. This Anglo-French dichotomy is a bit too extreme. Telling the truth, these were the most functionally dynastic kingdoms that, yes, of course, as all the Romano-Germanic kingdoms required everywhere, in theory, like the establishment to give them green light for this succession, and there were always this sort of ceremonies dating back to the rising of the kings on the shields or migration era to some kind of, okay, you're crowned, we're here, we accept it, right? So they did well, I think, in the script to point this duality out. But since we're making a comparison between kingdoms, there is something subtly more relevant to point out as well. Here, continuing, says several Holy Roman emperors tried the same. However, Otto I, Henry IV, and Frederick II all had their successors rebel against them because of this. Yes, they all had their sons at some point rebelling to them, which happened actually also in other kingdoms. It was pretty late in time, also in the West, because there were feudal systems. Now, still, the monarchy in Germany, while not hereditary on paper, was often hereditary in practice, right? This is true. This is the point. Like, there is a general historiographical question about these sort of particularism of Germany. Some scholars with whom I actually disagree think that up to the 12th century, Germany was just like basically any other Western monarchy, and that things were ruined later on. And that up to that point, Germany could have simply evolved into a functional national monarchy. First of all, I don't like what-ifs. And my point is, yes, in theory, this is true. It would have been possible because what is not possible, right? But this would have required Germany essentially, and likely, not necessarily, in fact, succeeding overall in the purpose, bailing out from its mostly Italian expeditions, universal ambitions. This is what 19th century Germany nationalistic historiography mostly stressed, the idea that there were two Germanys, the Swabians, there were this sort of chimera chasers that wanted to go to Rome, etc., and the good, hard northern Germans that colonized the Baltic and got into expanding against the evil Slavs, etc. This aspect, for example, the Ostsiedlung, is not discussed really in the script. We'll refer to that later. Again, I understand all the needs of conciseness, let's say, but that can be useful for explaining further other things. My counter-argument to that historiographical view is that actually Germany was very different from the Western systems before. It was already an important hereditary system, right? Having, like in France, for example, from an early age, you do have an important recognition of royal power around a specific center. It was essentially Paris, the northeast, regardless of the itinerancy of the courts, from even pretty autonomous vassals. We talked about this in videos about 10th century France. There was none of this in Germany. In Germany, it was not really a center. There had been capitals like Regensburg, for example, in different times. But Germany was a much less developed land. They had much less surplus. As a consequence, the same ruling houses shifted more in terms of geographical distribution. You have Saxony, then Franconia, then Swabia, then initially it was Bavaria in Carolingian times, and then Austria in the 13th century. So it's complicated, and it's always a more polycentric system, whereby there is not really, like in northern France, a milieu of sort of the angry, tough, and rough, feudalized, stern, cold, brutal mother blippers that could be able to take over sort of the sensual south of Occitania, that had not developed very unitary institutions at all. It was taken over, right? There was an important distribution there of Frankish heartland compared to the rest of the system. This can be observed also in other countries like Italy, for example, where the monarchy also, the kingdom exists, but the monarchy basically evaporates, if not when taken over by the Germans nominally. Like, the center of the system is unequivocally northern Italy. It's Milan, it's Monza, it's where the Pavia, the Iron Crown, is where the Iron Crown is bestowed on also the same Germanic rulers that come from across the Alps. In Germany, it was none of this. At large, of course, the most developed part of Germany was the post-Roman one, and I mean by far, right? North and Eastern Germany were incredibly brutal and radically underdeveloped areas by Western standards. I mean, they still are to a degree in Europe, regardless of, thanks also, unfortunately, to socialism, etc. But it's actually, I mean, if socialism can even get there, it's also because this is a legacy going back to which areas had been historically civilized since when. We've seen these differences being really millenary in nature. In fact, what this mirrored not just an antagonism within Germany, but also different interests. I mean, with this imbalance, with a rich, developed South, with northern Italy just next door, of course you go for northern Italy. You don't go for northern Germany, right? It doesn't make any sense. That's also what literally every single emperor does, right? Even Otto of Brunswick that had to embody that sort of northern Germanness. He opposes the expeditions to Italy, and then when he becomes the ruler, he immediately goes for it. But this is the entire history of the German monarch during the Middle Ages, right? Speaking also of that decentralistic, centrifugal push of the local nobility, right? So you can argue that the script is right in saying that there was a degree of hereditary power wielded, in fact, by the famous houses of Germany. It was not just literally random noblemen from different houses every time, but sometimes it was also that. And there was a much greater level of decentralization in general since ever, and the country was just poor. It had not developed, especially a public idea of power, right? Romanization, for example, is a very important thing. It does provide you, even just for where Romanization had expanded, like Gaul was a much richer country. France is by far, in absolute terms, the richest country in Europe. In terms of demographics, of agricultural production, Germany simply does not have that. It's a sort of also still disconnected territory. It must be deforested, reclaimed. That's how and why, technically, there was already a major bias in favor of an elective system, because nobody had really ever managed, even at the peak of, say, Ottonian power, to or control directly the country as a whole, right? Or having a major, let's say a control on one major part of the country and sort of the other mostly following out of sheer hegemony. Germany had actually never had this. It would tendentially go towards that direction, but the actual basis, like in terms of absolute degree compared to other countries, was much scarcer. It could have been possible, probably, to, again, nationalize the German monarchy further, like to properly give it a much stronger territorial basis. But first, we've seen it, there was no real advantage in doing so compared to other international opportunities that could be, by the way, exploited by others, as well as, in fact, the Germans will find out the hard way in the 13th century, also in the one before to a degree. And B, the general capacity to do so locally was very difficult, was very scarce compared to other monarchies. I will not digress here on the sheer imperial dimension and how, of course, the Germans had managed to successfully secure the axis with Italy and to therefore augment their own power. That definitely helped, in fact, the development of the same German national monarchy. However, again, the bias towards an elective system was already pretty strong. Right? Things may change as well, because again, if you look at the Arpads, the Przemyslids, the PS, realize that there is a moment in which they nominally do control like a pretty wide system. They hardly have many competitors. Over time, these countries are also the ones where, again, which feudalism grows, and so they are getting civilized in the process because they receive essentially this broader Western, Southern European influence. They fragmented power. If you want to go anywhere, they have to develop this knightly class that also the script was talking about, and this entails, in order to be competitive, first of all, internationally, but it entails local power that is difficult to wield in countries that have literally not even ever seen a Roman city, or that had remained disconnected largely from the Mediterranean since ever, and just were colder, poorer, less inhabited, less interconnected, less productive, right? This is incredibly important, and I can't stress enough how Germany is actually more similar, in a sense, to these countries than the post-Roman ones, like England, France, Italy, Spain. These are more advanced places for most of the Middle Ages, all right? Germany does manage to grow. This is really interesting. Together with England, in fact, they have, in relative terms, actually greater growth than countries like France or Italy. However, they do lag behind. We're not the same throughout all the Middle Ages, right? Now, going on, the nobles generally preferred sons to follow fathers, and emperors usually indicated who should succeed them. When the Ottonian and later Salian dynasties came to power, both claimed endorsement from their predecessors. In the 12th century, Emperor Henry VI tried to reform the German monarchy into a clearly hereditary one, which, honestly, I don't think it was much of a thing. I think that at least Frederick Barbarossa was much more impacting, even in fact in providing Henry VI with some further premises to wield power, but also the guy died early, and it's not like Germany or Sicily that he had come to rule on were particularly more centralized at the time. It was a hell of a power. It's not to say that it wasn't. Henry died just before he was preparing what probably succeeded as an expedition against Constantinople. Also, the Fourth Crusade is not that far away, so there could have been a very German empire had they won at the Legnano, for example, against the Lombards before. And you realize that even after that massive debacle, the Hohenstaufen with the Hauteville marriage managed to get back on track as the greatest power of the time. However, Henry also ruled too few. I would say that the efforts to make the monarchy more hereditary were there. There is no doubt. But could they simply be ingrained into the German political culture at the time? I don't think so. So much so that I add, after Henry VI, things started to derail. In fact, the further with the script goes on and says the nobles agreed to recognize his 2-year-old son Frederick as successor. Consider that Frederick Barbarossa had associated his sons to the throne as well. So that was pretty much the same thing. This is just to criticize that Henry VI had specifically just, imposed this to the Germans, and that was the way to make things. But the reform went no further. In fact, the script says, Henry VI died prematurely, and the Pope demanded the nobles elect a member of another dynasty. which would have been the same had even, or even especially had been Frederick being recognized. Actually, in that sense, the succession to Sicily of Frederick II was maintained, but of course, had he succeeded with his father in charge, or leaving him successfully his reign later on, it's not like the Pope would have not tried to interfere in fact, German affairs, and more of course, the papal imperial relations later. The elections themselves were never transparent and weren't formalized until the 14th century. This was an elite affair where nobles chose their suzerain unanimously. Dissenters did not participate or left before the results were announced. Veto was not an option. In 2 instances, newly elected kings had to travel to Saxony and gain local approval separately in what was almost a second election. The dissenters could change their minds for concessions to simply refuse homage and start a rebellion. Thus, concessions did take place. However, they were not the decisive factor in the imperial succession and could not keep Germany divided alone. Yes, but as I was saying before, and I think this is important for getting it straight, this situation is just preliminary to it. Again, Germany is already particularly unbalanced compared to other major Western monarchy. And one could debate whether, again, in any concrete sense, the Germans could have behaved in a different way. I always say, like, let's not think that, like, you are more capable or informed on the situation than, I don't know, a German king of the 12th century about how to run your own country. This is valid, I mean, for everybody. I'm not referring to now the script's authors. This seems to me particularly relevant. Germany was so, even later on, its sort of explosion still entailed this particularly strong predisposition, right? There are episodes here, I don't think they talk about it, but for example, the famous struggle between Frederick Barbarossa and Henry the Lion. These two cousins that, again, embodied the Hohenstaufen, Swabian, and respectively, and the Welfen Saxon worlds. They had shared Germany in a way. Yes, tendentially it was sort of a dual system that already tells you that something is not really working, right? There isn't such a duality in France, even though the country has yet to be sort of reconquered, right? There isn't such a duality in England. There isn't such a duality within the boundaries of a specific kingdom in general. There's always a tendency for one center to be to have at least a more hegemonic area and the other to be eventually subjected to it, or at least not developing enough power. Here in Germany, you do see that different powers already wield a consistent capacity to influence the separation of power altogether in their leagues, etc. The possibility at some point of, because that's how the narrative normally goes, that the struggle between Frederick Barbarossa and Henry the Lion, that, as you know, ended up with Henry losing basically all his fiefs except his Alodia, that were at least at some point confiscated and restored to him. He was exiled also to England, etc. Would be like, had Barbarossa simply thought about uniting Germany and not going over and over again to Italy, simply that would have worked, and especially this was simply an option, right? When you actually look at the struggle and what was going on, actually Frederick Barbarossa did not care so much about Saxony, just per se. It's not like even if he, for example, could have gained a great amount of power by subjecting the north, he was aware that he would have triggered a hornet nest just for having done so in the face of basically every German prince. Mostly intervened against Henry the Lion because he was infesting the Rhineland episcopal territories that were so important for the same monarchy that he was obliged to respond, and more. There was, of course, that level of tension between the two in a broader hegemonic sense. It's not like that wasn't the point. It was properly a competition for royal power, and that was upsetting enough, but all to the point, again, that this system was already quite unbalanced under actually the peak of its power, Under Frederick Barbarossa, in relative terms, Germany reaches its greatest power in the Middle Ages. This is literally the greatest power as a whole, like the Holy Roman Empire wise in Western Europe, right? And at that point, you could have a situation like that, where you had essentially another regional power within the same kingdom, was also pretty big, as you know, and expanding further east. Also at the hands of these sort of more distant and difficultly controllable vassals that, however, because of the very complicated factionalism, could at point be very also pro-imperial at that point. I made as you know, a list of German states, like German lands during the Middle Ages in thorough regional description on YouTube. Going on, however, so they say this prior decentralization alone could have not done the fragmentation per se. Granted, we can definitely think so. That was a pretty balanced system of factors that at some point could have made even evolve the German market towards a more national direction, had just a relatively few changed. The script goes on and says, so we will need to explore other arguments too. The struggle for power, papacy versus emperor. Alliance with the papacy. Since we have mentioned the Pope, we might as well tell the whole story about the papacy's relationship with the Holy Roman Empire. The Catholic Church, the Pope, and Italian affairs in general were high priorities for the emperors, and therefore for us as well. For the early medieval popes, the emperor was first and foremost a protector. Italy was not a safe place, and the Holy See did not feel comfortable with the Arabs, Byzantines, and local Italian rulers on its borders. The pope needed the emperor to be strong and usually had the capacity to arrange that. In order to become emperor, one had to travel to Italy and get crowned by the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope. Thus, the question of who got to be emperor was ultimately in papal hands once the emperor was crowned. However, the Pope could not longer control him. I wouldn't say that. I mean, the entire problem of the investiture controversy was the fact that the papacy could control a big deal also after the imperial crown. And naturally, I understand that the script means it in the sense of, okay, the guy's emperor, we can simply revoke the title. Well, there was excommunication. There were lots of other ways to inflict, as we'll see now, pretty heavy blow to the system. The connection between the emperor and the pope brought the two into an intim Feindschaft, or bosom enmity. Eventually, this led to the emperor and pope becoming bitter enemies. The ground for their conflict was Italy, and also the way the empire was governed, specifically the imperial church. Despite the bouts of conflict between the empire and the papacy, the Holy Roman emperors found the church useful. They eagerly ceded the royal lands to the bishops, just like they gave lands to their vassals. In exchange, the emperors demanded the same from the churches. They did their vassals, military service, soldiers, money, and advice. Indeed, many emperors preferred ecclesiastical vassals to secular ones because they were celibate, would not start a dynasty of their own, and were imperial appointees. In a way, the emperor's habit of favoring clergymen as vassals was an effort to centralize. Yes, this is exactly the point. This had been the case since Carolingian times. Investiture controversy. However, as the papacy grew stronger and its standing and prestige improved, its bureaucracy became more complex and its treasury grew. By the 12th century, the population growth in Europe brought forth a new wave of monasticism. The popes canonized bishops, selected candidates for sainthood, and approved them. They no longer depended on the empire militarily, for the new Norman kingdom in the south of Italy could provide protection too. Gradually, the papacy emerged as an independent player on the board. Tensions between the papacy and the empire came to a boiling point under Pope Gregory VII. He still saw the emperor as a partner, although a junior one. Pope Gregory compared the church and the state to the soul and body. One was immortal and the other was profane and perishable. The Pope was superior to both. He was entitled to reject bishops and even kings if they were unfit for office. People who disagreed were, in the eyes of Gregory, agents of the Antichrist. The trigger came when Emperor Henry IV appointed the Archbishop of Milan. Pope Gregory disagreed with the choice and challenged the emperor's right to appoint bishops in principle. The conflict became known as the investiture controversy and would last in some form for the next half century. Things soon got ugly. Emperor Henry convened a synod which renounced obedience to the Pope and demanded his abdication. Pope Gregory excommunicated Henry and released all his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Faced with opposition in Germany, Henry IV traveled to Canossa. There he waited, clad in wool, barefoot, freezing, in the open air outside the castle. After the show of humility, the Pope lifted the excommunication. However, the ground for conflict remained until the mid-13th century. German monarchs fought nearly constant wars in Italy. Chroniclers and historians have simplified those events into a clash between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. It was more than a conflict over investitures. So I would little note, no, chroniclers and historians have not really simplified those events into a clash between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Actually, the clash between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines is the one that makes the investiture controversy more complex. So this may be just a formal but important note that I would point out in the script to be incorrect. And they're also, in fact, mirroring two very different realities. I mean, the general point is correct. Like, it's true that the Germans always struggled for the control over Italy, but it obviously wasn't a conflict just over investiture. In fact, the script says the investiture controversy was resolved rather quickly with the Concordat of Worms in 1112. This was and let's go on. For the emperors, this was a matter of controlling the rich lands of Italy. All right. So here we will see it better now, because what they talk about later is how the nobility grew in importance, and they are not really talking about the consequences of the Concordat of Worms. Here they basically say there was the Concordat of Worms, the investiture controversy was resolved rather quickly, and it's not really, it may be misleading as a concept, especially if you do not stress especially for this video's topic, what a failure the defeat in the investiture controversy was. The Concordat of Worms was the victory of the papacy, essentially over Italy. The Germans had, at least they would, of course, had the right to appoint bishops, right, for the pertaining level of the lay and temporal power in the respective countries in different ways. But de facto, what happened here is that there had been major wars, by the way, not just in Italy, that were big, and especially for that earlier pre-Worms type, we don't often discuss it. In Germany too, the famous Saxon Revolt, etc. And the Concordat of Worms is basically, okay, let's stop making war. I will not try essentially to enforce my power so directly on Italian affairs. Why though? Because Germany, especially as a national monarchy that up to that point had relatively functioned, as we've seen even with this elective system, whatever, but in terms of public authority, collapsed. All right, at least it was heavily destructured by the Concordat of Worms. I made a video specifically talking about essentially the feudalization of episcopal investitures in Germany after Worms. The fact that this great Ottonian and Salian effort to bring things together, to desperately concentrate power in a country where that was so damn difficult, came to an abrupt, at least halt, to a degree, because of this defeat, because of the fact that the Pope had leveraged the German princes against the excommunicated emperor. That inflicted a very heavy civilizational damage to the capacity of developing, again, a German public authority, a national monarchy, more concentrated power, right? This was a very heavy blow. The script that doesn't actually talk about it, but it's what fundamentally set a very important milestone in this process of gradual privatization of the system. And it's a pity they didn't mention it, because they pass to this aspect of feudalization and they make it essentially just a lay aspect after having talked about the say, ecclesiastical one. And they impute, of course, to this in part. They skip a bit here, also some crucial aspects, but let's simply read it. Triumph of the nobility. War is costly, and waging war requires resources. The imperial dynasty that ruled throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the Southers waged war extensively. To secure money, soldiers, and the support of the German nobility, those emperors reworked their relations with their vassals. This process was labeled as the feudalization of the empire, that, as we explained before, was also very much the consequence of the Concordat of Worms, that the failure of the emperor to extend his previously achieved control on the church, like in Ottonian times, it also did not really last, because also the issues in Germany. Remember, these rulers at the end of the day must come back to Germany, because if they can't control that, even they can't control Italy, and so you can't simply switch country and let the other go. They always have to go back and forth, because in fact they already don't have this pretty solid local basis to begin with. The fiefs became firmly hereditary, and their holders obtained full control over the cities. Staufers wanted to win, and they had to be generous, resulting in the further decentralization of the Holy Roman Imperial realm. In fairness to the Staufers, their reign was not all about decentralization, I would say. So, to wield power, they accumulated wealth throughout their reign. Much of the Staufers' core region of Swabia was consolidated under their direct rule, turning it into a political and socio-economic center of the realm. However, the emperors, well, I would say, yeah, but not in the sense that it was actually an hegemonic one, as we explained before in the conflict between Frederick Barbarossa and Henry the Lion. In fact, they mostly control Franconia and Swabia. Right? All the rest, again, it's mostly just a couple of landa, not much more. Again, yes, they wield power extensively, especially the German monarchs travel a lot, as it's typical for the centralized system to be sustained, again, also within a regional boundary by different courts making concessions as it serves. So it is part of the system. However, the emperors were less successfully in Italy, a land of cities, mountains, and malarial swamps that was far harder to bring under centralized rule. Well, it's not like Germany was that much more hospitable in an environmental sense. Actually, the opposite. Emperor Barbarossa saw a few victories, but after a certain river incident, he was no longer around. So they cracked a joke about the great Frederick. Frederick II could defeat individual towns. Remember, these were cities, right? We're talking about Italian cities. We're talking about in medieval historiography about towns. We're talking about cities. We're talking about civitates, which is a very different thing. In fact, from the very Germany that did not quite have that level of communal development. We'll come back on that. But not their coalitions. In the end, Italy was where the last of the Golden Bull and the rise of nobility. I don't know here what's the script about. Maybe it's a mistake, but anyway, Staufers met their hand. Yes, the last of the Staufers met their hand. There is the Golden Bull and the rise of nobility. I don't know whether there's a double title in between. Well, anyway, just made paste and copy from the transcript. Now, the very last of them did so in Naples on the executioner's block. After the collapse of the Stauffer dynasty, their possessions in Germany were invaded, plundered, and seized by rival families. Swabia lost its economic importance and political weight, and the Holy Roman Empire no longer had any semblance of a center. Imperial authority was, to put it allegorically, in the gutter. The nobles who had accumulated power and privileges in the past few centuries were now the ones in actual control. Once the Stauffers were gone, it didn't take the nobles long to formalize it. In 1356, Emperor Charles IV of House Luxembourg signed the Golden Bull. It established the College of Electors, a body consisting of 4 nobles and 3 archbishops. Henceforth, the Holy Roman Empire officially became an electoral monarchy. The electors were recognized as independent rulers, having full regalian rights. Their territories became indivisible. The Golden Bull was basically a Magna Carta of German particularism. Holy Roman Cities, this is yet another title. So yes, basically they nailed it correctly, and I think I like how they summarized this out, because lots of things naturally happened, but it is more or less what occurred. Of course, there were important passages like, for example, the minority of Frederick II, the fact that he went overruling Sicily even when he actually won after his enemies and became King of Germany, King of Italy, Holy Roman Emperor, and more. That did contribute to heavily destructure the system. Here, of course, they don't talk about the edictum in favorem principum, etc. It's not that important, but it would have helped perhaps to signal how the same Holy Roman Emperors preferred to rule the same Germany from places like Sicily, right? And this, of course, it's not a few, because if you're talking about the aforementioned universal authority that these sovereigns wielded, yes, they did get defeated in the end by the Welfs, by the Lombards, by the papal alliance, the alliance that the Pope had put together against them, but they had managed to wield an enormous power that sort of symbolizes the peak of the medieval Western Empire. That could have technically worked and could have helped to eventually rule over Germany as well, right? But there had been, yes, a significant privatization and decentralization to the point that overall the Hohenstaufen themselves would prefer to sell their own public rights to rule and trying to invest into something more privatistic in nature. And this happens, in fact, the script doesn't say it, again, they can't say everything, but it had begun before the end of the Hohenstaufen, way before that, right? Not just with the dictum, but also through some patrimonial policies, including the attempt to incorporate the very powerful Southeast German Babenberg state into a super one, essentially entirely controlling the Alpine Arc, and therefore the access to Italy that would have provided definitely the Swabians with an unprecedented level of power. In a sense, the Habsburgs will achieve that, and they actually kept wielding, even after the Interregnum, telling us, with a pretty seriously large amount of power. It just was not enough to restore public authority anymore. But there was also there, like, the 14th century crisis, world-wise, which did not really help. The script doesn't talk about it, but I think it's very important to explain what happened in Germany, including the same years of the Golden Bowl. I made a video recently about, of course, Charles of Bohemia, but also in other videos we have seen how strongly the Black Death contributed everywhere to shrink universal powers everywhere, to regionalize, to provincialize most of the times power. It's also to enhance a certain national monarchical profile. Paradoxically, this is what would happen in Germany as well, but in a moment of actually of withdrawal of power. In fact, they will use this in the script later to say, well, you know, they started to base Germany mostly on a national level, maybe we're going to that direction. The greatest damage was done already in this sense, that it's not like, again, the Habsburgs didn't come close again to try to reunite Germany. Technically, in the first part of the 30 Years' War, even succeeded in doing so. But I would have pointed to that you can have a very strong private power as well. This is essentially and paradoxically what the French, say the Western Franks, had gone through in the 10th, the 11th, the 12th century, and that the Germans were reaching exactly now. Creating now the premises for a state with the glue represented by feudalism, by decentralization, right? This tells you how late sort of Germany was, how Central Europe was compared to the other countries in terms of actual development, so that you can explain better why eventually the German monarchy failed. Because that also happened too close to the Black Death to actually having, like, repeated what, say, happened to France in the 13th century, for example, in relative terms in Germany. Add to the fact that, again, Germany was not as developed as France to begin with, also in relation to these other Western powers. And so you understand why they got down in the Ancien Regime period after this literally kicked in after the 14th century crisis to not remount anywhere. In fact, the monarchies that really had failed by that point would stay failed, and or even if they could wield substantial power, would at the end of the day, you can argue up to the, well, in some ways throughout the early modern age, but some up to the Central Powers during World War I would ultimately fail compared to the West, right? We'll have to talk about this because it's naturally a very important topic. Even the Second World War. In any case, this aspect I don't say like too much. I'm not entirely convinced by this. I will explain it now, because now they talk about the cities of the empire, and specifically the German ones, right? So here we are typically in princely Germany. I made 3 videos about that topic, including one dedicated partly to the German communes of the later Middle Ages. And the script says, by the end of the 14th century, the Holy Roman Empire was well fragmented. However, we still have to explain why it stayed divided for so long and failed to centralize. For that, we should leave the nobles and the priests for now and address the third big component of the empire, its cities. When it comes to centralization, cities are natural allies for an inspiring monarch. Cities needed a central force to bring order, reduce uncertainty, impose uniform laws, and cut internal affairs. This was the way it worked in France. And German cities were not much different from the French. I would be careful here, and I will explain now why. In any case, they resented noble taxation, hated the tolls that every local lord made sure to collect, and demanded some uniform legal process. Ecclesiastical lords were especially unpopular. Cities like Worms, Cologne, and Strasbourg had all fought against their local bishops. However, the emperors were unreliable allies. The power they conceded to the nobles included power over cities. For urban dwellers, an alliance with the monarchy was simply a bad idea. Cities had to rely on each other. They united and formed city leagues, including the Swabian, Rhenish, and Lusatian leagues, and of course the Hanseatic League. Together they organized defense, regulated weights, measures, and coinage, and fought for better trade deals. Hansa in particular behaved almost like an independent state. It waged foreign policy, engaged in wars, and monopolized trade in the Baltic and North Seas. Hanseatic cities could even depose kings in Denmark or Sweden, and they didn't need the empire to do it for them. Habsburg attempts... okay, this is yet another chapter. So I'm not really convinced about this analysis. Like, really, if you have a clear idea of the... I will wrap it up in the end, say better. But if you have an historiographical idea of the relevance of the communes in Germany, you know that actually weren't anything impressive at all, right? Even the Hanseatic League that I made some content about is actually the proof that you need many different towns to unite to have essentially what is a commercial leverage over other powers. And essentially they can have it, not much because they have a great power on their own. On the contrary, they're messy. They don't have any sort of broader regulation. They reflect in many ways the German shortcoming that occurred at Aristotle monarchic level. The Scandinavian monarchies were weak, let's be honest. The German territorial powers in the hinterland were also weak. But in northern Germany, they were the weaker in the system. So actually, as soon as stronger states formed both in Scandinavia and northern Germany towards the Renaissance, the Hanseatic League loses its relevance. Also, the other leagues that were mentioned, especially like the Swabian, the Rhenish ones, fundamentally lost to the nobility, right? They did have the aforementioned relation with the emperor, that were free imperial cities that in theory should have been, as the script says, like the best friends of the emperor, exactly because they were free in the sense they formally obeyed by constitution just to the emperor, not to any other nobleman. However, emperors were noblemen. It's not like they liked the third estate too much, even though they relied themselves on important cities. I mean, think about the Habsburgs in Vienna already, but it was not like there was already a concept of capitals, and frankly, the again, from a historiographical point of view, the German communes are notoriously known for being particularly limited in power. They basically had their own control within the city walls. They could expel, as this script says, even their own bishops, except these would maintain around the entire city and over pretty large stretches of land, massive estates that control the entire countryside. And so technically these communes go nowhere, right? This is not like the Italian communes that have just territorial states on their own. They're powerful as entire kingdoms on their own. These German communes do not do practically anything. If anything, the fact that there are these leagues, that there are these coalitions that manage to hold at times with great difficulty and ultimately losing the nobility, only reflect how much they were freaking out because of, in fact, ecclesiastical and nobiliar power. The only bigger success at large was, of course, the Swiss Confederacy, however, in territories that were ever more distant from any sort of concentrated power. Also, let's stress this fundamental aspect. In Switzerland, in the later Middle Ages, there wasn't absolutely anything. These were some of the poorest and less productive areas of the entire Germany. And so in many ways, like today, of course, it's a bit of a different story, immediately. Also because it's not Germany anymore, among the other things, but I'm talking wealth mostly. And if you look at the notorious picture of Germany is weak cities, but really very weak overall. And here I understand the parallel with France, because here it says by the end of the 14th century, so the greatest parallelism I can think with the power of French cities sort of rebelling to the nobility of sort is not fitting to begin with, because it's not really correct to even think that, but it's the bonne ville de France at the end of the 15th century, mostly the fact that the monarchy tended a much more developed state like France that was properly very structured, very hierarchical. The English also did not have any of this, especially at this point. In comparison, they had bailed out. France does tend to provincialize power, and so individual cities become very important as centers of power, but it's not because like they have a seigneury on their own, or they have a power on their own, or their states on their own, right? The country is overwhelmingly run by the strongest princely power in the entirety of Europe. And so even though France, as we've said before, is very populated, it's very rich, it has big cities. I mean, even southern Italy had big florid cities, but they were under a feudal monarchy, right? And they didn't have the great relevance, like, again, the center or the north that had literally states on their own. And in Germany, even less than that, right? There are some passages from Machiavelli that, for example, praises the German towns because of how internally organized they were, also militarily, but we're told there's a bit of rhetoric there, because he wanted to say essentially that the cities could defend themselves. He's classicizing and Romanizing, but the communes in Germany basically are Germany is run by bishops and counts. That's Germany, literally. And yet there would be much else to say about this all. For example, today I did not discuss the fact that from an incredibly old era, everybody in Germany is somebody else's person, right? This is very different from other parts of Europe, but it's even more deeply ingrained in this essentially failed state picture without public authority, without any rule that the one of the local mobsters, and that basically controls an overwhelmingly peasant population that, as we have explained also in the video about the German peasant revolt, was brutally and radically subjected in a heavily psychological way into some sort of traumatic subservience for centuries to come. I mean, Germany up to literally the 18th, the 19th century was this, right? It still heavily and shockingly informs great part of German culture that was definitely mirrored by this level of feudal fragmentation. So speaking of these cities, here, this is like a little paragraph in the script. They inserted it for the sake of completion, but the point doesn't add to the point, meaning that if cities could not expand, it's because, in fact, the princes were so strong, and you can't present the cities as another factor that prevented centralization. Now that there's this strained relation with the emperor because they don't really care too much about them, they were weak. That's why he didn't care about them. And they were weak because noblemen were strong, and this was because that failed state that we described. It was all fragmented. So you can't make it rhetorically a point for, on top of any other player, there were the cities that were sort of rowing backward in terms of decentralization. What kind of power did the Ansa have compared to, say, a reinforced princely power in the hinterland? Right? They were actually under princes in the hinterland because those princes were sort of terrestrial power, and the various Hanseatic towns engage in this external power. But let's not represent even the power of the Hanseatic League. Right? It was just easy to be a bully with the Scandinavian monarchies that also regained their base, and differently from these towns, as it's also kind of obvious in civilizational perspective. If anything, it was local German counts in the north that hijacked, Denmark at a point. Yes, they had the support of the League, but don't think that a cluster of towns without any statal profile above them actually is this agent that acts as a quasi-independent state. No, right? Venice does that, right? And it is a city ruling over cities. This is a completely different reality. In Northern Europe, it has nothing to do with that, and especially not in terms of power. It only shows the dysfunctionality of the system. Right, and so as for Worms, Cologne, and Strasbourg, do you know them as significant powers outside of their actual episcopal one? No, right? So there are important pages, of course, of burgher resistance against the episcopal power, because if anything, the diocese lays in the city. But do they manage to dislodge them? They don't even dislodge them in an institutional sense, meaning the bishop remained and the archbishop of the same one of the city. Just the city negotiated his entrance, got something out of it, but it ends there. It's not like a power that contributes to alter the broader order. So these leagues of cities are pretty lame when it comes to battlefield power. They do manage to show some concreteness, some capacity, some stubbornness, but overall it's not a successful endeavor. And so I would have not really inserted this, nor I would have drawn that parallelism with France. I understand how calibrated the scripts are, so I'm not saying that by approximation this information is useless in absolute terms, but to the relative terms of the video, I don't think it's useful. I think it's slightly misleading, if not openly against the point of this video at the end of the day. So here there is the modern history part. Let's go through it. And the Habsburg attempts at reform. This did not mean that the emperor simply gave up. If anything, the empire was on a rebound. The new dynasty in charge, the House of Habsburg, was here to stay. One might even say, the Holy Roman Empire was stronger than ever before. If the Habsburg motto was to be believed, Austria is to rule the whole world, much was achieved under Emperor Maximilian I. From then on, the elected rulers of Germany did not need to be crowned in Rome as emperors. To better govern his patchwork realm, Maximilian introduced the imperial circles. For the emperor, this was a useful instrument for raising troops and money. Formal noble meetings were replaced with the imperial diet. This was an empire-wide institution that could make binding laws. Maximilian himself was in charge of it. He opened the diet, put forward his agenda, and retained the right of veto. The decisions of the Diet had to be approved by the emperor as well as by 3 colleges, electors, princes, and cities. Under the Habsburgs, the empire was a night watchman state. It was a policing the Habsburgs policing institution that could, at least for a while, stop excessive violence in its territory. The lords, princes, or otherwise feudal entities still performed day-to-day government, but the emperor had the power to intervene when necessary. Reformation in the So basically, this was about the 16th century as a whole, mostly the age of Maximilian, then passes to Charles V. Was the empire stronger than ever before? Well, after the reunification of the branches of the House of Habsburg, Austria was legitimately a strong regional power, naturally going from there to, like, let's reunite Germany, or let's simply, in this sense, go past the Golden Bull and or simply reunite this tendentially federative system into something more centralized is a bit too far-fetched. Even had, I don't know, the Reformation not happened or 30 Years' War being won, or this kind of things, right? This system does not exist in a vacuum. Actually, I made videos about this. The Habsburgs benefited from the fact that they didn't really have such a close, say, enemy center of power, right? Yes, they had the Ottomans next door later on when Hungary fell, but at large in Central Europe, they were a bit the hegemonic force that was better structured as German power that had, as you know, colonized far and wide Central up to Eastern Europe. But that was in that sense just like a blob, right? And in fact was difficult to individually pin as part of a broader structure, right? And so technically, yes, the emperor exists. He exists also as king of Germany. He has an international standing. Say the Italian wars are not particularly successful for Maximilian. There is a dysfunctionality compared to the French, the Spanish. So it's difficult to see now Germany as something simply remount. I think that the heaviest blow had been given by, again, the 14th century crisis. When we look at the so-called Ancien regime, you realize that Europe was growing at a slower speed, especially in Central Europe, than it had done in the peak of the great medieval civilization. So here there was just so much that the system could do. I made videos specifically explaining how messed up like the entire administration of this system was, how privatized, how much properly lacking in public authority it was, and how it was basically a heraldic forest more than much else, right, in terms of at least what was happening in Western Europe in terms of statehood, etc. So going on, Reformation in the 30 Years' War. The Habsburgs, however, made the same mistake as the Stauffers. They overextended themselves. I doubt that this is a historically acceptable explanation. This is, in fact, a cliché that was mostly expressed by 19th century German nationalist historiography, because they tended to reason nationalistically and not universalistically. And so if you read, say, look at the empire and say, but these guys failed at the end of the day, the reason why they failed is not that they sort of overextended, but that was the only way to nest somewhere that could have provided them with any kind of stronger power. That already happened elsewhere. Indeed, the local bases were too weak, as we've seen, to pursue, again, a new universal policy, but it wasn't at this point like disproportion compared to the actual possibilities. Right, and here talking about Charles V, we'll understand it a bit better. Nor the Hohenstaufen, as we've seen, actually had done bad at all. They managed to go pretty far, and had they succeeded in some other occasions, like single battles, etc., we'll be talking about something different today, perhaps. Maybe not in terms of a lack of fragmentation in Germany at large, but maybe something less than that. Now, Maximilian's successor, Charles V, was quite a busy man. I'm reading from the script. Aside from being the Holy Roman Emperor, he was also the King of Castile and Aragon, King of Naples, Sardinia and Sicily, north of the Netherlands, Duke of Burgundy, and the master of the Spanish colonial empire. Charles V was not the ruler of the world, but he came closer to that title than most. Charles ruled the empire for 40 years. Most of that time was spent fighting wars with France, the Ottomans, and their allies in North Africa. According to his own account, he had been to Germany 9 times, to Spain 6 times, and to Italy 7. He made 10 journeys to Flanders, 4 to France, 2 to England, and 2 to Africa. He made 8 voyages to the Mediterranean and 3 to the Spanish seas. Although this was an impressive travel record, it was not a sign of effective administration, which is a bit the point we were making before. Charles' home front didn't make his job easier. A certain Martin Luther was already spreading his views throughout Germany, and he was not alone in this regard. Although Charles did win a war against the Protestants, winning peace was beyond his abilities. Faced with the Protestant stubbornness, French opposition, desertion of his allies, and overall external pressure, Charles V abdicated. Not long after, the Holy Roman Empire found itself in the 30 Years' War. Okay, so here we skip. Big deal, because, say, the chapter on Charles V is old, but about Germany, I understand that here the thing had to be put together without too many in-depth analysis. However, say, yes, I appreciate they highlighted the peak of power at Maximilian's time, but say Charles V probably, and at least the development of the Habsburg monarchy in Germany, would have deserved slightly more attention in the dynamic. In any case, sparked by religious divides, it became an international affair and was mostly waged on German soil. Of the empire's 5 million population, about 1 million became casualties. Invading armies plundered and terrorized the lands they moved through. Water sources were left contaminated, cities were shelled by artillery fire. The emperor's core territory, Lower Austria, lost about 1/4 of its population. The Habsburgs were exhausted. Prague had fallen, the Swedes were threatening Vienna, and Bavaria was overrun by the French. 4/5 of the empire's strongholds were in the enemy's hands. The only positive was that France and Sweden didn't trust each other. In 1648, in Westphalia, Austria did get a peace deal and remained a great power. So you make it simple, but of course, like, you can argue that, that there was a possibility of success, that at large, yes, the Habsburgs failed once again. There is some German particularism that I would point out in this regard, including the fact that by the 14th century, Germany had reached, for example, Italy in terms of population, which is not a few, and in the 16th, it was in fact the most technologically advanced country in Europe, together with Italy. So Germany was very civilized. The 30 Years' War was a disaster for the country, there is no doubt. But in spite of all the French interventionism, Gustavus Adolphus, the general disruption of the possibility of settling at least a confessional unity in Germany, that, as we've seen, Charles V had to give up already by the mid-16th century. The country was ready for some further compaction that occurred in the further generations. Here, the video basically, the script heads towards an end. Here I delete all the subscription part because it's... Now, for the empire, however, this was a definitive end to any attempts at consolidation. Conclusion. The fall of the Holy Roman Empire, Europe after the Peace of Westphalia, was a different place. It was a continent of sovereign states with defined territory. But they were still part of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Importantly enough, in this world, the Holy Roman Empire truly was an anomaly which defied categorization. It had an emperor who on paper was the supreme ruler, but it was also a confederation of equals. But it's not like in the past, technically, this was the case. The Germans had maintained always that sense of greater sort of egalitarian sense of power among, of course, the oligarchs, because people, as we explained, they're counted literally nothing. Since ever, like you can look at since Ottonian times, it was already the case. So it was part just of the specifically traditional German mentality and political culture that, just like today, there are different states within the federation. Its lords claim to be sovereign rulers because here I cannot digress in the traditional concept of power and how this sort of mutual recognition of power from both sides still entails some kind of hierarchy. In fact, the Habsburgs disagreed in terms of to modernizing terms. But here again, the script ends, so of course there isn't too much to point out. Austria still mattered and was a champion of the empire's smallest entities. To summarize, it was a mess. They say. In 1806, the last Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, declared the empire dissolved. By that time, it was viewed as an anachronism, as something abnormal and freakish. Once Napoleon was defeated, the great powers of the time decided not to restore it. The empire's 1,000-year-long story ended. It was a victim of its own ambition, a textbook example of extension. Again, I disagree. Obsessed with a global mission, its rulers failed to keep their allegorical backyard in order. This is not correct. I can't disagree more. The empire certainly left its mark on history, for better or for worse. So this is just like there's a saying in my own language that basically says you want to balance two things at the same time just to end, and the video ends like that. So what can I say? On the last part, like, yes, if you just buy Voltaire's statement because you want to embrace a secular and modern idea that the Holy Roman Empire was an abomination, or that it was not felt by its subjects, or that this wouldn't even live on in some aspects of European political culture and beyond, it's one thing. The Habsburgic Empire continued anyway, and that carried a lot of that prior system. I disagree completely on the fact that the best way for the system to to prevail because the title is "Why Was Germany So Fragmented?" Right. So we starting from the presumption of a German national monarchy to be established rather than a universal obsession for empire. Well, this is essentially what could have really been established. What we're looking at in terms of European unity in many ways, in a cultural, political, and international sense, regardless of the statal boundaries, is exactly what distinguishes us as a great continental power from other countries that were under a single rule. And this is a concept that really, I think, is central to understand European history. And I understand that these channels engage in some sort of more conventional, I detest the term mainstream view, etc. So I think these channels are always winking at the watcher because they say, you have heard that before, so I'm telling you that, with cracking some joke in, as we've seen, making some subtle reference of stuff that was going on. Some of the most glamorous examples without explicitating them. At large, let's say, my experience, and my followers know this, I have a pretty intensive comparative and diachronic view of political and institutional developments across Europe, and this video tends essentially to focus the attention on almost a German evenemential political history. So I imagine that who wrote the script sat at a table. They were told, look, you have to explain more or less what were the factors that politically destabilized Germany at basically political, say, international, not simply national, but international level, and make a list of that and make it fancy and make it sound right. I understand that. However, the, say, explanation of why was Germany so fragmented especially doesn't actually record more than much. I mean, of course, the key point is the fact that in the 13th century the puzzle had been created, more or less remained the same later, because there was no attempt to sort of territorial political reunification in a direct controlling sense. There were chances, but these were lost. So overall, the video is not it's not bad. The script is sensible. It's correct. Of course, from a historical point of view, these channels know their deal. It's not like they are giving false information, unless like there is an interpretation that in fact doesn't quite fit the general picture. Again, some aspects, as I was pointing out before, regarding, for example, how the cities behaved, or this notion that the empire was practically just a chimera that did not fix the inherent issues of the country. Actually, even if you want to pursue it, it is not the case, because again, pursuing a universal policy was surely more rewarding for Germany in terms of what also came back to the country. It could have simply been yet another Central European one without too much expansionistic capacity. Instead, in the Middle Ages, I think conferred great vantage and prestige to its rulers, also contributing to develop a civilization in Germany that again is, especially in the later medieval times, particularly relevant, and in spite, in fact, of this political fragmentation that did exist. It was pretty much messy, was much more pronounced than WUM. However, largely the French, the English, the Spanish, the Italians, but really not the other Central European rulers. I mean, at most, like, you pick Italy, they had, I don't know, like 30 states. The Germans counted 300. But if you move east and you actually start analyzing Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, and beyond, you realize that the level of fragmentation, if you start studying all the various clans that rule there, the oligarchs, the magnate power, it's overwhelmingly pronounced, right? And so the German system may not be that dysfunctional at whole, right? The Sonderweg, in this sense, is correct. There was something about Germany that, for example, managed to preserve, if not its centrality in Europe, evidently, because the French basically substituted themselves to the empire. In fact, the capacity to withstand even powers of this kind. I mean, how many times did the French try at all time, under Philip IV, under Francis I, under Louis XIV, to also successfully at some point grab some chunks of the empire, but how much they were rejected, or at least nobody really thought to even seriously conquer Germany at any point throughout this time, to exercise a sort of foreign control. Like in Italy, for example. Italy was much more, advantageous to control, and also more advanced and richer and more connected, better connected. So this external control is actually feebler than it seems. It was just like for maintaining, as the peninsula did, some advantageous position in relative peace and prosperity for a couple of hundred years. Germany was a very different world, a more dysfunctional one for sure, but at the same time it managed to preserve its own uniqueness without falling under somebody else's power, and actually being a power to be reckoned with. The Ostsiedlung is also very relevant. The Germans had managed to literally expand their own country, like from the Elbe to the Oder and beyond. If you look at the Baltic state, of what had been the vestige also of the Teutonic Order, it had managed to be actually the strongest state, of course, in Central Europe. It was enormous. It was an enormous system. It was, in this sense, monstrous and weird and strange in many ways, but at the same time, it was not like a depressed country by the European average at all. So it's difficult, of course, to tell German history because it's so unlike the one of many others, especially other kingdoms that followed definitely a more monarchical direction. So it's definitely obvious that people want to ask themselves why this happened, but it seems to me that this video explains just half of the story, the political one. From a social point of view, they don't say, look, this country was fundamentally different from its neighbors. Right, it was sort of the least developed, the post-Carolingian ones. It had massive issues. It had not known civilization before the Franks arrived there, by the way. The Carolingians were, say, civilized, but not perhaps in a completely entire potential meaning of the word. And in general, it's a country that was made in these centuries, that in fact had a clamorous success out of the booming of itself. That is also a product of some desperation. I mean, for example, the Ostsiedlung is, like in other times in history, can be interpreted as a migratory phenomenon dictated by the lack of resources in loco. In many in many cases, except this was arranged still within a German system whereby there were rich people that had the means to fundamentally finance the Aussiedlung, to settle even in other monarchies and to make money in the process, and to make those German communities more successful than the surrounding Slavic or Vlach or Hungarian ones. And so this is, I think, one of the most important aspects of the narrative that shouldn't, in fact, either exaggerate the level of centralizing potential, nor the one of actual success of German culture and the same empire that was, again, at some point the strongest power in Europe, and also had this important revival during the Renaissance and was largely successful just at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, showing that, of course, like there was a Spanish support. We're not going to digress in this, but say in general could be reinforced, could be extended to a certain degree of national control. Excuse me, I drink a little. So this seems to me the point. There is a basis for which this country was already different since the beginning, and it's as if it even made too much, and not in the sense that it overextended, but in the sense that in fact even managed to extend to that degree in the first place, because there was nothing about its prior background that would actually suggest it would become more, tendentially hegemonic at some point in European history, in the High Middle Ages and peak of great medieval civilization, hadn't there been a massive moral strength of the Germans that were also, again, very much hierarchically framed, very brutally ruled, but for this reason desperate and angry enough to be able to even aim at, in a quite serious way, to a universal achievement that was not too far away, right? So, of course, it's debatable. If you want to accept the script's ultimate judgment, that is to say, had they tried to nationalize first, it would have been better, just do it. But I would also observe German history, and it's not like people were just obsessed at the idea of the empire as an explanation for the fact that the Germans sought to obviously control the very rich and very politically fragmented Italy as well. So, of course, that failed, so it can't historically be taken as just, okay, they were still doing good, because at the end of the day they did fail. But it's not something you can simply connect to a general, okay, they should have not done it before. Like it's like just centralization in Germany. Are you sure that it would have actually succeeded? Are you sure that there would have been a more compact German reality? Maybe, I don't know, they would have simply been knocked out more easily with a more centralized rule. In the previous centuries, would have a much more disarticulated Central Europe than today as a consequence. Instead, I think overall that things adjust. Of course, there was a lot of, by the way, this is very important, there was a lot of self-sabotage from the German side, from the German princes to the imperial cause, right? So that's also a progressed cultural, social reality. That is to say, many Germans did simply not want the establishment of a more concentrated power, which is typical, again, of peoples that tendentially have a lower public and civic, public education and civic culture than others. And it's perfectly explainable in the case of Germany in historical perspective, talking medieval history. However, there still was a lot of potential for a great growth, a great success. It's said that, if Henry the Lion had sent his Saxons in aid of his cows in Lombardy, in time, the Battle of Legnano would have been won by Barbarossa, and maybe we would be talking about a stronger Germany in the following generation, something different to have happened. You can't really say that. I wouldn't be so tranchant especially when it comes also to the ideology of the empire that was pursued basically by everyone, and that, you know, so sparked admiration towards the Germans on different occasions, exactly because it was seen as a matter of necessity for those time standards, right? The ultimate explanation would be ridiculizing this beliefs as the ones that people held at the time, which is, I don't know, probably not the best way to talk historically. So overall, I don't have much else to say. This say kings and generals content is, generally speaking, I already control it sometimes, fair. I think sometimes they pursue a bit too relatively say biased avenues to get the views of a specific target audience, to the point maybe of adjusting slightly historical narrative to fit that that purpose. I made some examples of this at the beginning. I can't say what kind of videos they make. Let's go check that out, because again, I don't even watch them. I just copy the script and I comment on it, like we've done today. We read it and we criticize it. But in general, I don't even know what they're uploading. They upload very fast. They probably have lots of people behind it just to make a great effort. I mean, I upload a video every day, and I'm a small channel because I have just just my limited means and generals. Okay, let's see. 3 million subscribers. They released a video about the rise of the Habsburgs, even though none of those Habsburgs looked like the guy in the thumbnail. But you see, looking also at this one that I commented, the thumbnail, for example. I don't watch pictures. I didn't comment on pictures, but the thumbnail is, why so fragmented? And so there is a picture of basically it's the extent of the German kingdom in the full Middle Ages, including, by the way, the Italic kingdom. In there, it's all drawn as if internally was hyper-fragmented. It doesn't even follow the actual fragmentation, because the thumbnail, I think, was made in a bit of more of a random way. It doesn't actually follow the I think so, because it looks to feel like colors. And all the kingdoms around, including the Papal States, Hungary, Poland, France, and they're all in a uniform color, you know, as if at that time there weren't a myriad of seigneuries in fragmented states within those same actual kingdoms. Let's remember also Germany was a kingdom, and so here it's the video is made to say, oh look, this is the stereotype of the border lore of this hyper fragmented system. But at the end of the day, is this really what was actually the case, especially in the full Middle Ages? And was Germany so damn fragmented in proportion to other neighboring countries? It's not really like that, especially when you start throwing around terms like centralized, because fragmented, centralized, or decentralized is something else. All right, it means two different things. You can have a hell of a power by not being centralized, and Germany at large for a long time had that as well. So it's unfair, because it also territorially, geographically doesn't show. It gives people that fake impression that the system was hyper fragmented compared to these other systems that at this point really wasn't. It's like, I remember the video about the fragmentation of Italy. It was done in the same way, and I watched it at a point, and it says, oh my god, the Italian peninsula was so fragmented. In that moment there was the picture of the kingdom of Sicily, this enormous thing completely united in that color, and sort of showing how it wasn't of course, Italy wasn't unified as a whole, but why should it have been at the time? So it's, and there are, in my opinion, again, lots of other sort of backgrounds that look too much as a premise to the political and, let's say, evenementality in an official, formal sense, and that don't actually look at the cultural and social backgrounds of these realities. Also, how, for example, how the military system worked. I know that kings and generals make lots of videos about these topics, but even in that case, they seem a bit too structural. I know that it had to make sense with a few time. This video was 19 minutes, but we're almost 20. In fact, the script was a bit too long. However, these are the kind of mistakes that I don't like too much. Sometimes, even from the thumbnail, that it sounds too much like a clickbait of some sort. Here I see nothing. There is a lot of World War II. Not much else, I think, that I would like to comment. It's lots of videos at large, and yeah. There is oddly some kind of, the topics they make are fairly good, at least they are provocative enough. For example, from legionnaires to knights, Roman military manuals in medieval Europe. That I detest. I hope that they didn't say, but what I would have pointed at a very different legacy in warfare. And in any case, let's leave it at that. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.